Do you believe that sometimes a trip as ordinary as going to market for a cow can open the door to an entirely new life out here in the West, where winter spares no one? Even the smallest decision can change everything. And today, I want to tell you about Jonah McGraw, a man who lived more in silence than in speech, a man who set out to buy nothing more than survival, yet came back with something heavier than food. Believe me, this story will hold you until the very end, and if somewhere along the way it stirs that old loneliness inside you, don't forget to tap that like button to keep these frontier tales alive. And leave me a comment telling me where you're listening, from a breezy country porch or a small room tucked away in the city. I promise if you stay with me to the end, you'll see why some journeys never finish the way we think they will. Now picture an autumn morning in 1882. The sun had just cleared the low ridges, its weak light spilling across frozen ground. From a distance came the sounds of men, cattle, horses, and the rough laughter of traders' signs that the fair had been alive since long before daylight. And among that noise rode Jonah McGraw, tall in the saddle, broad of shoulder, but with eyes that carried only the emptiness of a man who had nothing left to lose. Jonah was 47, though his strong hands and hard shoulders made him look younger. Only the lines at his eyes betrayed the truth, years of long winters spent by the fire alone, summers working the fields without a soul to share it with, and the small grave on the hill behind his cabin, where his wife, Margaret Hale, and the child she never bore lay side by side. Since the day he shoveled that last mound of earth, his cabin had known no laughter, no voices but the wind through the boards, and the hollow sound of his own heartbeat. So this morning's trip wasn't about company, nor cheer. Jonah came for one reason, only a cow. Just one animal, but it meant milk through the snow months, a slim chance at survival for his broken herd, and the hope of seeing spring without losing everything. His old horse carried him down the red dirt track, hooves striking a rhythm to match the weight of his thoughts. He remembered the storm in early October that had killed 2 calves, no great loss for another man. But for him, it was a hard blow. With so few cattle left, each life was as precious as gold. That was why he'd tucked the small roll of bills into his coat, enough for a single strong cow if luck was with him. But luck was something Jonah had long since stopped expecting. He was used to mornings when silence greeted him louder than any sound, used to meals eaten with one bowl, one spoon, one shadow stretched across the wall. At his age, most men had bustling homes, wives calling their names, children running underfoot. Jonah had none of that. He had graves, an empty cabin, and a solitude so deep even whiskey couldn't drown it. The fairground was already thick with people, laughter, and deals being shouted over the bawling of cattle penned in rough rails. Jonah tied his horse to a post and stepped into the crowd. He walked slow, shoulders still square, eyes sharp, but his face locked tight as a shuttered window. He looked over each cow, carefully ribs, flanks, eyes knowing he couldn't afford a mistake. The noise pressed in from all sides. Yet inside Jonah it was emptier than ever, his own footsteps sounding louder than the shouts around him. He didn't joke, didn't barter more than he had to, because whatever words passed his lips here, they would vanish into nothing once he rode home to that cold cabin. The laughter of others only made his solitude sharper. Folks think loneliness comes when you're alone, but Jonah knew better. The deepest loneliness is when you stand in the middle of a crowd, and still no one truly sees you. And it was right there, in that sea of noise and bargaining. While Jonah's mind clung to cows and coin, that fate placed in front of him the one thing he never expected, a turn in the road that would change his life forever. Jonah McGraw stood among the crowd, his eyes still on the cattle penned behind rough rails. He kept forcing himself to focus, to weigh every coin in his pocket, because one mistake could cost him the winter. But then, through the noise of bargaining, the bawling of livestock, and the stamping of hooves, another sound cut through laughter, not the kind that warms a gathering, but a sharp, ugly laughter, the kind men use when cruelty feels like sport. Jonah turned. At the far end of the yard, where dust swirled around wagon wheels, an old cart had been pulled up. Beside it, a group of Apache women stood chained, their hands bound, their faces hollow, clothes torn, skin streaked with dirt. A half-circle of men crowded around, swilling cheap whiskey, shouting crude jokes. Among those bowed heads, one figure held Jonah's gaze. She was younger than the others, her long black hair tangled but still catching a glint of sunlight. Her eyes stayed fixed on the ground, her shoulders trembling as if she willed herself not to collapse. That was Tayanita. Her deerskin dress had been ripped open at the chest, forcing her to fold her arms across herself. Every time she tightened her grip, the men jeered louder, and yet, though she shook, she kept her back straight, refusing to crumple. Jonah felt heat rise in his chest. He had been a cavalry soldier, had seen war's savagery up close, but this public humiliation of women sickened him to the bone. The auctioneer climbed onto a crate, his voice shrill, "Here she is." Stubborn, proud, not worth the food she eats who'll take her. Men howled with laughter, one tossing back a drink, another spitting in the dirt. Jonah's fists clenched. He told himself to turn away. He had come here for a cow, not for trouble. He had no money to spare beyond that one purpose. But his gray eyes locked on Tayanita's trembling arms, her jaw clamped tight against the shame. Each laugh struck Jonah like a hammer, and memory crashed in Margaret, his wife, dying with their unborn child, that day of helplessness, the soil falling over both graves. He had sworn never again to feel that powerless, yet here he was, staring at another soul being ground down as if she was nothing more than stock. "Cheap price who's brave enough to take her," the auctioneer barked. A fat man tossed a coin in the air and bellowed, "To wash my dishes." The circle roared with delight. Jonah's jaw tightened. His pulse pounded in his temples. He had lived too long swallowing injustice in silence. Not today. His hand slipped into his coat, closing around the thin roll of bills meant for a cow. It was not much, but it was enough. He stepped forward, boots grinding into the dirt, the crowd's noise faltering as his tall frame moved into the ring. "How much?" His voice was low, steady, carrying farther than a shout. The laughter spiked again. "He wants to buy her," one man crowed. Another sneered. "Can't tell a woman from a cow." Jonah gave no reply. He shoved the bills into the auctioneer's hand. The man smirked, shrugged it was money all the same. With a careless snap, he cut the rope. Tayanita flinched at the sound, her head lifting, for the first time. Her eyes met Jonah's dark against gray. Fear and disbelief flickered there, but also the faintest spark of something else, the shock of being seen as human. Behind them, the jeers rose again. "Fool, you've bought yourself trouble." Jonah ignored them. He let the rope fall to the ground, stepped aside, and waited. Slowly, uncertainly. She followed, her bare feet stumbling once before finding balance. The crowd's taunts faded behind them as he untied his horse. Jonah mounted, then reached down his hand. She hesitated, then placed her cold fingers in his, sharp bones pressing against his palm. He pulled her up behind him, and together they rode away from the stench of manure and whiskey, into the clean bite of autumn wind. He knew well enough what he had done. He had no cow to show for his money, no certainty about what lay ahead. He had taken on danger, burden, and questions he could not yet answer. But Jonah also knew this: he could not have left her there, standing beneath the laughter of men who saw her as less than human. That single choice, one moment of defiance against cruelty, would change the course of everything that followed. That evening, as Jonah's horse crested the final ridge and the dirt road opened into a narrow valley, Tayanita saw the cabin, small, weathered, its boards bleached gray by sun and storm. The chimney leaned slightly to one side, and the rail fence sagged in places. In the yard, 3 gaunt cows stood huddled together. This was all Jonah McGraw had left. She slid down from the horse, her bare feet striking the cold, hard ground. The torn dress clung to her frame, and she drew her arms tighter. Smoke from old wood fires still lingered faint in the air. Tayanita said nothing. Every move Jonah made. She followed with wary eyes, the eyes of someone just out of one trap, and fearing another might spring at any moment. Jonah led the horse into the shed, stripped the saddle, then turned back without looking at her too long. He knew that gaze well, the distrust of one who had been treated as property, who had endured ridicule. He asked for no thanks. He simply walked into the cabin, leaving the door open for her to choose whether to enter or remain outside. Inside. The room was plain, 1 bed, 1 rough table, shelves with jars of beans and cornmeal, and a small iron stove. On the table lay a handful of dried beans, a bit of cornmeal, some salt. Jonah set a pot on the stove, dropped in beans and a strip of tough pork, and let the fire take hold. He moved slow, deliberate, so she could watch every step. Tayanita lingered at the threshold, arms folded across her chest, her eyes scanning every corner. It wasn't curiosity, it was survival. She studied the shadows, the layout, judging each object for threat. When the beans were ready, Jonah ladled 2 bowls and set them down. He didn't beckon, only sat and ate his share. After a long hesitation, she stepped forward and perched on the edge of a chair, as if ready to flee at the slightest shift. She ate in tiny bites, pausing after each, glancing sideways at him to see what he might do. Jonah kept his eyes on his bowl, steady and silent. When the meal was done, Jonah went to an old chest and drew out a blue work shirt, worn soft with years of use. He laid it across the bed, then turned back to the stove. For a long moment, Tayanita stared at it, not believing it was meant for her. At last, she reached, drew it over her shoulders. The hem fell to her knees, the sleeves nearly covered her hands, but it hid the torn dress that had been her shame at the fair. When night came, Jonah spread a blanket on the floor near the door, rolled his coat for a pillow, and lay down there. The bed he left for her. No explanation, no promises, just action enough to show she would not be touched, she would not be forced. But for Tayanita, that did not dissolve the suspicion. She lay on the bed, eyes wide in the dark, listening to his breathing, to the wind through the cracks, to the fire snapping in the stove. She had learned too well every man demanded something. And his silence, his distance, only deepened her unease. She did not yet know what Jonah McGraw wanted. Jonah, too, lay awake on the hard planks. He heard the wind scrape at the door, the stove tick, and the heavy silence between them. He thought of the empty purse in his coat, of the missing cow he'd meant to buy, of the mistrust carved into her gaze. He knew this road would not be simple. At dawn, Jonah rose, as he always had. He stoked the fire, set a pot to boil, and measured out the last of his coffee. When she stirred awake, still clutching the blanket tight, he placed a crust of bread on the table. No words, no pressure, just bread. She looked at it, then at him. For the first time, surprise flickered in her eyes. She took it, ate slowly, still watching every movement he made. Jonah caught her glance and gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Go on. No one here will take it from you." Those first days in the cabin were wrapped in strangeness. A man who had lived too long in silence. A woman who had been treated as a commodity. Suspicion hung between them like a heavy curtain. And yet, the smallest things, a shirt, a bowl of beans, a separate bed were seeds, small, fragile, but seeds all the same, signs that perhaps, just perhaps, this place would not be another cage. The days that followed in the little cabin were no longer only silence and suspicion. Winter work left no room for idleness. At dawn, when mist still clung to the valley, Jonah went out with his old axe. He split a heavy log, the sound of steel cracking wood echoing across the emptiness. Tayanita stood in the doorway, watching every move. Then, without a word, he held the handle out to her. For a moment she hesitated, then took it. Her first swing glanced off, barely scratching the surface. But she set her jaw, raised the axe again, and let her whole body follow through. This time the log split, splinters flying. Jonah gave a slight nod, enough to acknowledge the effort. From that day on, they worked side by side, stacking wood in neat piles under the eaves. The sound of the axe became more than labor. It became a rhythm they shared, drawing them closer. When he brought her into the horse shed, Jonah taught by doing his hand scattering oats, his brush working down a coat slick with frost. Tayanita watched closely, then copied. At first, the horse shoved its head against her shoulder, and she startled, but instead of backing away, she stood firm, hand trembling as she laid it on the animal's mane. After a moment, the horse snorted softly and stilled, breath puffing white in the cold air. Jonah glanced over, saw the faint curve of a smile tug at her lips. He said nothing, but inside felt a weight ease, as if a thin layer of ice had melted. The fences around the pasture sagged under snow. One afternoon, Jonah carried out hammer and nails. He braced the post, and she leaned her shoulder to hold it steady. Each nail was driven in turn, his strength driving the hammer, her resolve holding firm. When they stepped back, and the rail stood straight again, their eyes met. No words, no praise, just a nod from him and a look from her. Less guarded than before. Inside the cabin, Tayanita began to leave her mark. She rearranged the shelves, lined up the jars of beans and cornmeal, placed thread and scraps of cloth in a wooden box by the hearth. She hung dried herbs overhead, their scent cutting through the smoke. At first, Jonah only watched in silence, a frown flickering when things were no longer in their old place. But slowly he realized the cabin, once lifeless, now breathed. The quiet was no longer empty. It was filled with the small sounds of a home. Meals began to change, too. Jonah had lived on beans and salt pork. Nothing more. But Tayanita dropped in sage, a bit of onion hidden in a jar. The fragrance filled the room, turning plain food into something warmer. Jonah ate without comment, but when he set his spoon down, his eyes softened. She noticed, and the corner of her mouth lifted, almost a smile. Each night, Jonah still spread his blanket by the door, while Tayanita lay in the bed, yet she no longer clutched the quilt to her throat as if bracing for harm. She listened instead to the steady rhythm of his breathing on the floorboards. For the first time in months, her eyelids closed without fear. The silence between them was no longer a wall, it was a covering, light and protective. One evening, she sat sewing by the fire, patching his worn coat with strips cut from the very dress she had once been mocked in. When Jonah stepped in and saw her, she froze, needle in hand, as though expecting anger for touching his things. But he only said, voice low, "Good." Just one word, yet heavy with meaning. Her shoulders dropped. She bent back to her stitching, her eyes no longer darting away. The world beyond still held danger, still held men who treated women like trade goods, but within the four walls of that weathered cabin, through work and the quiet sharing of labor, another kind of bond was forming. Not a rope binding her down, but a thread weaving them together. Jonah remained a man of few words, his frame still hard with silence, yet sometimes his eyes lingered longer on what she did. And Tayanita, once shrinking in fear, now walked the cabin upright, as if she belonged there. Trust was not yet strong, but the seed had been planted, and in the heart of winter, that small spark of warmth was enough to begin. It was a gray noon. The snow melted into patches of mud across the yard. Jonah and Tayanita were hauling water from the creek, the steady sound of the bucket against the wooden trough filling the silence. After weeks of working side by side, the valley had grown strangely calm. But then came the sound that broke it. A horse's hooves, steady, deliberate, drawing closer down the dirt track. Jonah straightened, his gray eyes narrowing toward the road. Out of the trees came a bony horse, ribs showing, carrying a man in a long ash-colored coat. His hat brim hung low, but the crooked grin on his face was plain as his gaze landed on Tayanita. "Jonah McGraw," the man drawled, voice slick with mockery. "Heard you brought something curious home from the fair, and I see the rumors were true." Jonah didn't answer. He set the bucket down and shifted, planting his shoulders squarely between the stranger and the woman behind him. Without looking, he knew she had shrunk back, clutching the handle tight, her breath quick with fear. The man swung down from his saddle, boots sinking into mud. "Caleb Boone," he said, though Jonah already half remembered him from town, a trader of tobacco, cheap whiskey, and gossip. Boone tilted his head, eyes glinting as they slid over Tayanita like a hand. "You've got something I'd like," Boone said, voice oily. "Not a cow, not a horse. Leave her with me, McGraw. I'll pay fair coffee, tobacco, maybe even a good pair of boots." He grinned, showing yellowed teeth beneath a ragged mustache. Tayanita stiffened, fingers twisting the coarse work shirt Jonah had given her, shame and dread flashing across her face. Jonah stepped forward until only a few paces separated them. His voice was low, gravelly. "She's not for sale." For a beat, silence. Wind pushed across the open yard, carrying the bite of cold. Boone chuckled, shaking his head. "Not many men hold out long. Women like that, they're nothing but trouble. You'll regret it." Jonah didn't flinch. He stood firm as stone, gray eyes locked steady. The weight of his silence pressed back at Boone until the trader's grin faltered. Boone spat into the mud, muttered a curse, and swung back into his saddle. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. She'll bleed you dry." With a jerk of the reins, his horse stumbled forward, hooves sucking at the mud until the sound faded into the trees. Only silence remained. Tayanita sat by the trough, pale against the dark of her skin, her hands trembling. Jonah bent, picked up the bucket she'd dropped, set it upright, and said quietly, "He won't be back." She lifted her eyes, searching his face, and with the little English she had, whispered. Why, Jonah's jaw worked. At last he said, slow and certain, "Because you're here. And here is home." The words were plain, without flourish, but they landed heavy. For Tayanita, it was like a blade cutting through the thick fog of doubt. Her hand loosened from the shirt, her breath steadied. That night, as firelight filled the cabin, Jonah lay in his usual place by the door. Tayanita sat close to the stove, his old coat wrapped around her shoulders. Flames lit her face, her dark eyes shining with something new. She wanted to ask why he had paid for her at the fair, why he stood firm against Boone. But the words caught. In the end, only one sound left her lips, her name. Tayanita. Jonah opened his eyes, turned toward her. He repeated it. Steady. Sure, Tayanita. In that weathered cabin. A place once filled only with silence. The name rang out like a promise. Outside. The wind tore through the boards. Inside. The fire burned bright. Both of them knew one danger had passed, but it was a warning. Greater trials were still on their way. After the day Boone left, the air inside the cabin felt different. The danger still lingered like smoke after gunfire, but in the silence of evening, something had shifted. Tayanita no longer looked at Jonah with eyes only full of suspicion. Now there was searching in her gaze. And Jonah, who had grown used to keeping everything locked in his chest, began to realize he couldn't stay hidden forever. One night, as they sat by the fire, Jonah set his spoon down, pointed to the pot of beans, then touched his chest. Mine, he said slowly. He repeated it again. Careful, deliberate. Tayanita frowned, studying him, then mimicked the sound mine. The word came halting, uneven, but her eyes lit faintly. She pointed to her own portion, pressed her hand against her chest, and added, Mine too. Jonah blinked, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his chapped lips. For the first time in years, warmth rose in him from two simple words. And so it continued. Night after night, they traded small pieces of language. He pointed to a chair. She repeated, hesitant but determined. She counted, in turn, pointed to the fire, speaking Apache words, strange and soft. Jonah echoed clumsily, tongue stiff. Sounds crooked. Tayanita laughed just once, short and sharp, startled by her own sound. It rang in the cabin like a bell, breaking the long, cold silence. Sometimes words weren't needed at all. When they hauled water together, and her hands trembled under the weight, Jonah quietly took one side of the yoke. Their eyes met for a breath. No translation required. When she bent over his coat, stitching careful seams with steady fingers, Jonah caught himself watching longer than he should, not with the pain that once accompanied thoughts of Margaret, his late wife, but with the recognition that someone else was pouring care into the small, ordinary tasks of his life. Another evening, after the meal was done, Tayanita set her needle down. She touched her chest and spoke softly. Husband, dead. Her eyes held no tears, but her voice was heavy. Jonah froze, the whetstone stilled against his knife. He drew in a breath, then nodded. Slow. Wife, child, dead. It was the first time he had spoken the words aloud since the day he laid Margaret and their stillborn child in the earth. Not at the grave, not in the nights haunted by nightmares, but here, to a woman who bore her own scars of loss. The cabin fell silent, save for the fire snapping. They looked at one another and saw the same hollow in each other's lives. No explanation was needed. The distance between them began to soften. At meals, Tayanita no longer pulled the shirt tight across her chest in constant fear. She knew Jonah would turn his eyes away when he set an old wool shirt before her and said simply, Yours. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, not out of fear this time, but something else. And then came a night unlike the rest. A storm screamed against the shutters, snow driving across the valley. They sat closer than usual, drawn by the need for warmth. Jonah fed wood to the fire, while Tayanita let her black hair fall loose around her shoulders. Their eyes met in the firelight, and neither looked away. Slowly, she leaned forward, lips trembling but resolute. Jonah stayed still, letting her decide. When her lips brushed his, light as a breath, his heart slammed against his ribs. He didn't seize her, didn't press harder. He simply answered with a tenderness that felt fragile, precious. That kiss ended suspicion, marking the first step from mere survival to something shared, not possession, but recognition. A confession without words, both bore wounds, yet both had found a mirror of their pain in the other. Later. She rested her head against his shoulder, whispering a phrase in Apache he didn't understand. Jonah answered softly, not alone, and for the first time. The silence inside the cabin was no longer emptiness. It was warmth, the soundless weight of two lives, finally daring to reach across the gap between them. As winter days wore on, and patches of snow melted into muddy ruts, the rhythm of work no longer carried loneliness. Every footstep in the yard, every strike of the axe, now echoed with two sets of hands and two steady breaths. The cabin, once only a shelter, had become marked by both Jonah and Tayanita, their touch, their voices, their presence woven into its walls. One late afternoon, Jonah came back from the pasture, coat streaked with mud, carrying a sack of flour. Tucked against his chest was a folded sheet of paper. He set the sack down on the table, then carefully unfolded the paper. Tayanita, stirring beans over the fire, turned to watch, her dark eyes questioning. Jonah laid the paper flat, in heavy, uneven letters. One word stood out McGraw. He tapped it with his finger, then looked at her directly. "My name," he said, voice low and rough. "Cutter. McGraw. If you want it, it can be yours." The room went still. The fire crackled. Beans and onions scented the air. Tayanita stepped closer, staring at the paper as if it were sacred. Her fingers trembled as they traced the word, then lifted to her chest. "Mine?" she asked, the English halting but clear. Jonah nodded. "Yours. If you choose." In that instant, memory swept over her the jeers of men at the fair, the way they bartered for her as though she were livestock. They gave her no name, only shame. And now here was a man offering not chains, not mockery, but a name to belong to. Her chest rose and fell hard. Then, with a small nod, she whispered, "Yes." Jonah felt a long weight loosen, like a rope unknotted at last. He folded the paper and set it on the shelf. No vow spoken, no preacher present, yet her nod carried more truth than any words he'd ever heard in a church. That evening, she set on the table a small loaf of bread, the first she had baked with her own hands. It smelled of wheat and warmth. Jonah broke a piece, chewed slowly, then gave a single nod. "Good." Tayanita laughed a true, full laugh that rang bright against the cabin walls. Jonah startled, then found himself smiling too, the kind of smile he thought had been buried with Margaret and the child long ago. That night, when Jonah rolled his blanket out by the door as always, Tayanita sat at the table, his old coat around her shoulders. She tried the word on her tongue, McGraw. The first time it wavered, she repeated it, "Stronger McGraw." Jonah turned, his gray eyes lit with something fierce and tender. She crossed to the bed, but this time she didn't turn her back. She lay facing him, her gaze holding his across the dim room. Jonah, lying on the floorboards, felt warmth spread through him, chasing off the cold that had lived in his chest for years. The next day, working on the horse shed, Tayanita moved with steady strength. When a horse shoved against her, she staggered but didn't drop the feed. Jonah caught her arm, steadying her. They stood close, breath mingling in the chill air. She lifted her dark eyes and whispered a single word, "Family." Jonah swallowed hard. He pressed his hand to his chest. "Family," he echoed, voice rough but certain. That evening, with the fire burning strong. Jonah reached to touch her hair, then drew her gently into his arms. Their kiss was no longer trembling, no longer uncertain. It was slow, sure, carrying the weight of two lives choosing one another. For Jonah, the name McGraw had once been bound to grief, but now, spoken on her lips, it carried hope, and for Tayanita, the word wife no longer meant chains, it meant a home, freely chosen, In that cabin beneath the ridges, they were no longer just the rescuer and the rescued. They were a family. Winter at last gave way to the warm breath of spring. The last patches of snow melted back into the earth, leaving the soil damp and dark, and small green shoots of grass pushed bravely up through the thaw. The creek, once locked in ice, now ran free, its waters rushing with the sound of new life. Overhead, birds returned to the valley, their bright songs scattering the silence that had pressed so heavy for months. In the midst of it all, Jonah McGraw's cabin stood changed, no longer just the shelter of a solitary man against the wind. It had become a true home, marked by 2 sets of hands. The shelves still bore the jars of herbs and spices Tayanita had carefully arranged. Bundles of dried sage and mint hung overhead, giving the air a fresh, clean scent. The floor was swept. The table carried the touch of a woman bread cooling, needle and thread set neatly aside, and a cloth laid across the worn boards. Each morning, Jonah stepped into the yard, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He watched the cattle that had survived the hard winter, ribs still lean but eyes bright as they bent to graze on new grass. Beside him, Tayanita shaded her brow against the sun, her lips curving in a quiet smile. The sight struck Jonah deep, not with grief, but with gratitude. He knew now that it was her presence that had transformed this place, her hands that had turned his cabin from a hollow shelter into a dwelling full of life. One midday, Jonah rode back into town. His errand was simple: to buy another cow, to rebuild the herd that would carry them through the next winter. Yet he knew, as his horse trod the rutted road, that this trip was not the same as the one he had taken months before. Then, he had ridden out with nothing but survival on his mind. Now, there was a hearth waiting for him, and a woman watching from the doorway. That changed everything. At the fairgrounds, the familiar noise and smells met him: shouts of men haggling, the bawl of livestock, the sharp bite of smoke and manure. Jonah could not help but remember the day he had come here last autumn, planning only to buy a cow, yet leaving with Tayanita at his side, jeered and mocked by the crowd. They had called him a fool, said he had wasted his money on trouble, but looking back, he knew it was the choice that saved them both. Jonah bought a sturdy cow, bargained quickly, and led it away. He wasted no time with the gossip of men. Their words no longer mattered. He knew where he belonged, and more importantly, with whom. When he rode into the yard, leading the new cow, Tayanita stood waiting by the fence, her eyes lit with relief and pride. But more than that, they stayed fixed on him, not the animal. Jonah realized then what he had known in his heart: cattle could carry them through the winters. But she was the reason he himself had survived his own long season of cold. That evening, they shared a simple meal: bread, beans, and a scrap of pork. Yet there was no emptiness in the silence between them. When Tayanita placed her hand on the table and whispered, "Family," Jonah covered it with his own and answered, "Family." No vow could have bound them tighter than that one word, spoken together. In the days that followed, the ranch stirred back to life. The fence line stood straight and strong again. The horse shed was patched with new boards. The cattle grazed under a warming sun, their coats shining. Tayanita planted seeds in the soil beside the cabin, hopeful for the promise of fresh vegetables before summer. Jonah stood watching her, a quiet ache of joy in his chest, knowing he had found again what he thought forever buried. And friends, if you've ever known the hollow weight of loss, if you've ever believed that life could hold nothing but sorrow, I ask you to look here at Jonah and Tayanita. He went to the fair only to buy a cow, but what he carried home was something far greater: a wife, a family, a future. Wouldn't you agree that Jonah has earned this happiness that a man who once lived with nothing but silence now deserves the laughter at his table, the warmth at his hearth. He stood up for her when no one else would, gave her not chains, but his name, and together they've built a life stronger than any storm. So let me ask you, what should their next step be? Should they grow the ranch, preparing for children and a new generation? Should they mark their bond with a small wedding, a gathering of neighbors to witness what has already been chosen in their hearts? Or should they remain as they are, quiet, steadfast, content to share their love in the valley they now call home? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you hope for Jonah and Tayanita. Do you see them as the beginning of something larger? Perhaps the heart of a new community? One thing is certain: spring has come, not only to the valley, but to their lives. The cabin that once echoed with nothing but wind now holds laughter. The silence that once cut like a knife is filled with warmth. Jonah McGraw found what he thought had been buried forever with his wife and child, a family, and a reason to live on. And Tayanita, once mocked and treated as less than human, has become the soul of a home. That is rebirth. That is hope. And I'd say, friends, there is no treasure on this frontier more precious than that.